Hello and welcome to This Is Your Life Path, a podcast where I sit down with tabletop game designers and we have a chat about all of the things that have influenced and inspired them away from the tabletop world. I'm your host Kayla, I'm a game designer myself and I publish as Ratwave Gamehouse. I do games all about connection and alienation. I recently put out a remaster of one of my earliest released games, Plural Witchcraft Highland Rampage, where you play a group of Highland witches sharing one body on a mission to rescue someone who you care about. Now to jump into the episode and introduce today's guest. My guest today is the wonderful, multi-talented Marx Shepherd. Marx, would you like to introduce yourself?
It's very kind of you. My name is Marx Shepherd. I am a sometimes freelance editor, a sometimes game designer, a sometimes project lead and community manager. People might know my voice from Yes Indeed Pod if they're particularly long-memoried. And yeah, I'm just continuing my mission to be TTRPG's most horrible goose. So that's my general aim in life. Yeah.
Yeah, a worthy task. Thank you for coming on the podcast. Can dive right into the questions if you want.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for having me. It's quite an honor to be invited onto such a fledgling podcast.
Taking to the skies. So, where did you grow up, Marx?
I grew up in Nottingham, which is, for those who don't know, it's quite a small city in the middle of England, in the East Midlands, and it's famous for. Well, it's famous for Robin Hood, which a lot of people will know about, which is always a sort of bone of contention with people from Nottingham. But it's also quite famous for Games Workshop, so that might
Is Games
might
Workshop
have coloured
Nottingham
my.
based?
Yeah, it's just on the outskirts of Nottingham. I don't know how long it's been based in Nottingham, but it's like Games Workshop, well, Warhammer World, as it's now known, is there. And as a youth, I knew people who worked there, and they'd take me to Warhammer World and show me all of the wonderful dioramas that they had there, and made me feel very inadequate as I was terrible at painting and playing playing tabletop games. But I spent a lot of my life between the ages of about 9 and 14 thinking about Games Workshop miniatures and feeling inadequate compared to other people. So I feel like it was quite formative, as it is, I think, for a lot of British role players and wargamers, really.
So was that that large shadow of Games Workshop your introduction and awareness with sort of the idea of what role-playing games were?
I don't know. I sort of felt like it pushed me in the opposite direction because I was I was really bad at Games Workshop. I'm very bad at painting. I don't have the patience for it. I'm an absolute terrible wargamer, like just unbelievably bad. I think my record was losing within about 2 rounds. Really, I mean, I didn't have enough miniatures to make it work, but I was always very bad at it, and I think that sort of pushed me into the opposite direction. Because when my friends around me had like lots of Games Workshop stuff, and they had the codices, the codexes that were produced for Warhammer 40k, I loved them because they were full of all this really interesting lore. And I mean, you're probably getting a theme here, but like in general, I'm much more about the narrative, and I'm not really interested in the mechanical crunch of what happens when you roll a scatter die. I'm more, well, what stories is this battle telling? What's the overall arc of this battle? And I think that probably set me aside from quite a lot of other 13, 14-year-olds who are interested in Warhammer. But I think it was quite formative, but perhaps by pushing me in almost literally the complete opposite direction. So
Yeah, I guess if something casts so much of a shadow, it makes sense that any reaction to it is sort of about it in some way.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. like I think I sort of go away now. I mean, later when I was kind of maybe in my early 20s, I looked at games like Inquisitor and um, I'm trying to think of what they're called, like Rogue Trader and Dark Heresy, like which are really good, quite well written role playing games about the Warhammer 40k universe. And I'm like, yeah, I kind of wish I'd held onto my miniatures and were able to play these. I mean, Rogue Trader is like it's really interesting because I've played it once and thought this is kind of my thing because I sort of like D100 systems. Then I listened to an actual play of it on the One Shot Network where everybody died, and they were like, actually, this is quite a lethal system. This is sort of OSR before OSR was the thing. So
Right. A very
it's
war is
interesting,
hell
and like
approach.
yeah, it's that very long. It is a long shadow, and it's like I'm still vaguely interested in 40k. I'm still vaguely interested in the Warhammer Fantasy role playing game, but I guess from kind of an academic interest more than a, this is a game I want to go out and play. I'm very excited by. So I don't know.
Yeah, I understand there. I get what you mean. So do you still live in Nottingham, or did you leave?
No, I left. I went to university in Sheffield. I was there for 4 and a bit years. And then I moved to Leeds, where I still live. So,
Oh, cool, cool.
yeah, gradually creeping up north.
My life is the strange opposite, where I was born um, in Chester and then gradually got more sort of south. And I sort of imagine at some point this is like a slingshot and I'll be fired, I don't know, all the way up to Scotland somehow.
I mean that does sound quite nice actually.
So that like these different places you lived, how I guess it sounds like you've mostly lived in cities, but in comparatively smaller cities within the UK. Do you feel like the sense of like what a
Mm.
city is something that influences much of your writing or how you think about setting or even just about how you think about people in a place?
That's an interesting question because like I didn't live in the centre of Nottingham. Like I was sort of on the outskirts and in a place that was quite close to not open countryside, but kind of what you might call the edgelands, which is the sort of link between the countryside and the city. And in Sheffield, I mean, I don't know how well you know Sheffield, but it's super green. Like you can walk from one side of the city to the other without leaving a park if you're careful. So and then like on the west of Sheffield, obviously you've got the ridiculously easy access into the Peak District. So I never really felt like I lived in the middle of a city, even when I did live in the middle of a city. And then in Leeds as well. I live in North Leeds now, and it's so close to the countryside. You know, like you can see, you can almost not quite, you can almost see Ilkley Moor from my house, which is I don't know, quite a famous moor, shall we say, for various reasons. And it's just like I've never really felt that attached to cities. Again, it's kind of like that academic interest of I kind of want to like cities, but at the same time, I'm just not that interested. I sort of feel a bit more of a kinship with countryside and a kinship with land. I mean, perhaps this is a very towny thing to say. I've never actually worked that out, but um, I don't know. Maybe it's just nostalgia for something that I've never actually experienced.
I mean, that's a very like human reaction though, especially when it comes to art. I guess also thinking about like the shepherdess and art that's drawing on, which is often about sort of nature and conversation stuff, which is not always necessary direct from people. It's a thought that's occurring to me sort of in a half-formed gestate area.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I sort of think I don't know, like what I've been thinking about with the shepherdess and other things I've been doing recently about. I've got this really long-winded idea about doing something about cattle drovers, which I think would be really cool and a really interesting way to tell narratives about landscape and things. And it's all kind of coming together in this. Actually, maybe this is what I want to write role-playing games about. Maybe this is what I want to do writing about and make art about in general. It's just like maybe this kind of pastoral landscape, which is both beautiful and in many ways brutal, is maybe what I want to think about, in kind of contrary to other people who write about cities and how humans live in cities. Well, what about how landscapes live around people, and the contrary as well? Is that an interesting enough story to make a game about? Is that an interesting enough story to make, just a weird random encounter in another role-playing game about? And it's just something that I've become gradually more and more interested in. I don't know. Perhaps as I've got older, it's difficult to say.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and I think, maybe older, maybe at least relates to like changing perspective and moving and stuff. I definitely feel like I think more about place as a adult who's lived in different places, and
Yeah.
than I would. Then I and I to be clear, I'm not saying this as a criticism of this. Then I imagine like my siblings or other people I grew up with who have not really moved from the place we grew up think about it.
Yeah.
But maybe that is idle speculation. I obviously don't know the interior of anyone else's mind.
Well, I feel like if you move between places, and I think this is true of a lot of things, that you kind of have more of a questioning about what it is about that place that you like, what it is about that place that you don't like. If you stay in one place and don't question that, then perhaps you don't gain quite so much of an understanding about it. I think that about a lot of things, that like if you go away and question something like quite deeply, then perhaps you get more of an understanding from it than somebody who never goes away and questions it, but is also very content in what that is. I mean, I'm being really coy about this, but I think that applies to a lot of things. That some of which are very intrinsically linked to our identity, and some of which are maybe more tangentially linked to identity. And well, I don't know where I'm going with this, but I think both viewpoints are completely valid. Like it's totally fine to just be really comfortable in a place and just like be happy there, or it's equally happy to have itchy feet and want to go away and explore and live in loads of different places. And sometimes we don't have that choice. Sometimes we're forced into circumstance, and that's also obviously a valid point of view. So
yeah, exactly. It's a huge thing to, I guess, hold in your head. I guess thinking back to growing up, though, did you have a clear idea of what you wanted to? Do you have either a memory of some of the things you wanted to be when you were a kid, or do you have a clear memory of like wanting something cool?
I think when I was about 4 or 5, which is the age of my middle child now, I wanted to be a racehorse jockey. Excuse me. I'm not a tall person, but I am too tall to be a jockey. So that was quite soon, obviously ruled out. As I got older, sort of 10, 11, and then for quite a long time after, I thought, I want to be a fiction author. And I think that stuck with me for a long time. And I did a lot of creative writing when I was little. I was writing poetry, I was writing novels, I was writing short stories, loads of different things. I don't know, like writing screenplays and stuff. Like, probably, I mean, it was obviously all terrible, but I think developing that creative writing knack and habit when I was younger, like that's something that I think is really important if you want to then go away and be a creative person later in life. And I think that kind of carried on. Sorry?
Did you finish much of the writing you were attempting when you were younger?
I mean, it's easy to write a poem. Everything else you need stamina for, and you need to have a clear idea of where you're going. And I think when I was probably 12, maybe I finished the first, multi-chapter thing that I was writing, and I thought that's pretty cool. And I think probably about that time, you're kind of being pushed in various directions at school. People are saying, well, what do you actually want to be when you grow up? What are you good at? and this is kind of the point where I was thinking, actually, maybe I'm not good at that. Maybe what I want to be is like a lawyer or a solicitor, or later maybe what I want to be is an architect, or later still when kind of everybody had said, I don't think you'd be a very good architect. Not just like random people, but like architect departments that I was applying to university at,
Oh wow.
saying, it's probably not suited to this. So at that point, going away and saying, well, maybe I'd like to be an engineer because I think I would be good at that. And actually, I am still an engineer of sorts, and I am quite good at it. That's fine. But at the same time, there's kind of this 11-year-old me saying, don't you still want to tell stories? Don't you still want to go away and do creative writing? Don't you want to make art, I guess? And yeah, I guess I probably would still like to do that. So, coming back around to it now when in my 30s, thinking, oh yeah, actually making games and telling stories, that's really good fun. I should do more of that.
Do you feel so? Obviously, you mentioned writing, but you also did have an awareness of what role-playing games were more when you were younger. I guess thinking about like the first time you did sit down and were trying to write like an RPG, did you find that was almost thinking like a transition between more straightforward fiction or other kinds of writing, or was it something you didn't necessarily even think of in those terms?
I think I'm trying to think when the first time I sat down and started thinking about doing game design was. I think I was probably at university, and I'd been playing quite a lot of 7th Sea, which I love. It's just one of my favorite role playing games, and I'd been in a year-long campaign as part of university role-playing game club, and I'd GM'd a game on and off for a couple of years for some of my friends, and we had a great time doing that. And then I was like, oh, I'm quite good at this GMing thing. Maybe I could write a game, which is, that's the classic that's the classic
The Siren Song.
Yeah, exactly. You think you can do it because you've read all the role-playing game books, and you kind of like, oh, I know how to do that. And so I go away and I'm like, I'm going to write a really crunchy steampunk game that uses cards as a randomization factor, and it's all about I don't know, what was it about. It was like sort of a dystopian steampunk about how engineers are actually really evil, and as an engineer, I would say that's not necessarily that inaccurate. But like if engineers ran the world, it was basically a dystopia, and that's kind of where that all came from. And this was a bad game. Like I never finished writing it on account of it was just way, way too overwrought. Everything about it was terrible, and I wasn't concentrating on the stuff that I was actually interested in, which was the lore, the narrative part of it, the setting, and like what stories you would tell with it. So it's kind of that. I think I was probably not mature enough to write a game that I would have actually played, and that feels really weird to say, but I think that's probably the case. And having written stuff since that I have played and thought, actually, do you know what? That was quite good. I enjoyed that. And then I think 20-year-old me was not capable of doing that. And unfortunately, 35-year-old me probably can write a game and get quite a lot of entertainment out of it, and that's I think that's a good progression to make.
Yeah, it would be, I don't know, maybe I was going to say it would be sadder the other way, but obviously everyone's life takes their own place or whatever. Let's maybe wonder, do you feel like you have more of an understanding of yourself as a player of games from having partook in game design?
That's I think I understand more what I like, and I think the first role-playing game I've ever played was probably the starter set of 3.5 edition of Dungeons and Dragons. I didn't like it. I didn't enjoy it at all. My friends didn't enjoy it either because it felt very mechanical, and it felt very forced, and it wasn't something that I was enjoying. So I've basically never played Dungeons and Dragons, and I think what I've realized over the years is I don't like really crunchy games that put you on a particular path, but it's sort of more than that. It's kind of, I actually really, really like very narrative heavy games that deal with interesting subject matter. And I think that has meant that that's what I kind of want to write games about as well. You know, I don't want to write crunchy games. So I think, to answer your question, my game design practice has kind of developed from understanding what I like rather than who I am as a player, if that
Sure.
makes sense.
Yeah, no, I understand that. I believe that makes. So you mentioned engineering is what you do now, and I assume you studied engineering at university, because I'm under the impression you're not allowed to just go and do that otherwise.
You shouldn't be. I do know people who have, but yes, yeah. I was at university studying structural engineering of all things. I now work as a civil engineer, sort of, but what I actually do is computational modeling, which is very interesting. What I actually do is computational flood modeling, so I'm very connected to rivers and landscapes, which would probably not shock you.
That makes sense. I was going to ask, because engineering, my idea of it as someone who exists only really in a very far away humanity space. It's very like, I think of it as very like almost like blocky and about processes and machines. Whereas I was going to ask, like, oh, that's interesting because of the association with nature that's in a lot of your recent work. But that makes sense to me. That, I guess, yeah, civil engineering is all about the relationship between people and society and the land.
I think, and this is really getting into the weeds of it, really, but like flooding is really it. It kind of brings together a lot of what I think of as game design practice as well, because it brings together people and places and emotion. And like, I just think rivers are really cool, but like when rivers flow down the street and go through your house, obviously that's a traumatic event. That's a terrible thing to happen to you. And like bringing together the idea of a river bringing you a lot of joy and peace and calming, but also being something that can feel really threatening. And I was told a few years ago about like some kids who live in Hull. Hull floods a lot because it's like 90% under high water mark or something. Um, and there are a lot of kids in Hull who've had their houses flooded at least once. And like them developing sort of a fear of the rain. And that's really interesting because that sort of says this thing that a lot of people like find a nuisance or find comforting perhaps or calming. They like that sound, but these people who live in one specific place that has a very different connection to water and rivers are have a completely different emotional reaction to this. And like I just find all of these three tied together things to be really interesting.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like, our associations with things are not set by like some kind of like core nature. They're influenced by like the experiences we have.
Mm,
It's really
yeah,
interesting, and I can see how that does apply to some of the themes and things you've focused on in the
sure,
work.
yeah.
What switching tracks in a? I'm not good at segues on this podcast. I've realised, which is fine. I've decided I don't usually care about it, but I've definitely noticed I'm not good at segues. I was
It's
just going to ask,
fine, yeah.
what kind? Are you a wide reader? Were you a wide reader? Have you been? Have you been on?
Um,
You know, peaks and valleys with reading.
I this is really outing myself. I think I don't read a lot of fiction. I probably read maybe 6 books a year, which is probably like criminally low compared to a lot of my peers. um, I I really like speculative fiction. I really like sci-fi and fantasy, but maybe not like classic stuff. I was saying the other day that I think Lord of the Rings is a bad book, and people were very shocked by this. But like, I really like Octavia Butler. I really like, oh man, what's his name? Ken Liu, amazing author. I'd read Clara and the Sun recently, which is absolutely fantastic book that's full of really emotional responses to like artificial intelligence and feels very much like a book of our time. I can't even remember who that's by, Kazuo Ishiguro. I so that sort of speculative fiction of fantasy and sci-fi stripes is the kind of thing that I'm really interested in reading. But I also like really weird books like that are about a very specific subject. Non-fiction, a very specific subject that most people would find really incredibly dry. So I recently bought loads of books about drovers so that I could do some research. I just find it all extremely fascinating. I bought a book called Edgelands, which is by Robert Simon. No, I've forgotten who it's by, but it's a fantastic book which explores the weird spaces around cities that are not quite the countryside and are not quite the city, and an overwhelmingly interesting book.
Hmm.
um, so I wouldn't say that I was a wide reader, and I wouldn't say that I was a particularly diligent reader, but I am very interested in a very niche subset of kind of fiction, and then just non-fiction that I think is a subject which is very interesting, you know.
That makes sense. Thinking about, I guess, influence of writing, do you feel like the slightly like slice of fiction you are interested in influences much around like your writing style or how you can construct
um,
prose, or do you think that influence comes more from the, or do you think you pull influence there from the non-fiction stuff, or is the non-fiction stuff you're reading more an influence in terms of knowledge and information?
Definitely knowledge and information, but I guess if you were to examine my games, they don't feel very prosy. I
Hmm.
think I write in quite a matter of fact way. I think the biggest exception to this is Ghostbox, which I published recently, and that's
It
sort of
has
written,
prompt work, obviously.
and it's sort of written in universe as well. Like, it's written, the latest draft, which will
Yeah.
be released relatively soon, is like you are receiving a letter, and all of the all of the information that you need to go away and do the prompts for that is basically in in universe text. So it's telling you who this person is by way of like an implicit explanation of who this person is rather than an explicit one. And I think that it was really fun to write, but I'm not sure I could do it for anything longer than about 4,000 words, which is how long Ghostbox was. Um, just because I don't think I have the stamina to write full length works of fiction.
Hmm. Which I guess the more emphasizing of prose you're doing, it is taking in that place.
Yeah.
I think there is like to something like the shepherdess, and I could see something like a loud noise in a quiet place, like an almost instructional quality to um, like a very like sort of clear-eyed instructional quality to things mixed with uh,
Mm.
like I'm failing at words here, but I'm trying to say something instructional thing mixed with things that are sharing like your perspective, and it often feels like quite grounded in the fact that it is you writing, if that makes any sense. And feel free to disagree
Yeah.
with that if you want.
Yeah, definitely. Interestingly, it's sort of the kind of thing that um, my colleagues say about my technical writing as well, that it's written in a very matter of fact way. but that they can tell it's written by me, which is quite. I don't know if that's a compliment or not, but I think it's. I think I don't know. As a game designer, I would say that I think it's really important to have yourself in a work, because otherwise it can feel like anybody could have written that. Well, maybe that's not quite true, but like I don't like the corporate tone that some role-playing games take. And I'm looking particularly at the thicker works of stuff that do come out of companies. Like you wouldn't call nearly all of them corporations. You'd say that's a small company that, all of the people who work for that company wouldn't even fit on a bus. It's they're all small companies, but they take a very similar kind of tone throughout their works that is kind of very reverent, self-reverent. Whereas I don't feel like that. I feel like my perspective is interesting, my perspective is important, and that is how you are going to understand what it is that I'm trying to get across with this game. I think that's what I'm trying to say.
That's very interesting. Yeah.
It's just me sitting there bashing companies who produce books, really, which is maybe not that cool, but
sorry, I'll leave a pause.
I think I sort of felt like that. I felt particularly aggrieved about it when it was a game that I kind of felt like I wanted to care about, which was the Doctor Who role-playing game. And I flicked through it and I was like, yeah, this is really cool, and this is covering like all of space and time. That's fantastic. But also I'm just not remotely interested in the way that you've written this game. And then it could go away and find another game about Time Lords with the serial numbers scraped off, and be a lot more interested in it because it's written by I don't know, like some weird one-person band operating out of a shed in Tennessee. Like, who knows? I would be much more interested in that as a role-playing game than something produced, even if it's by fans, but with a kind of corporate mindset.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said for work, even if it feels more like flawed in very heavy quotation marks, obviously. But
oh no, I mean this Tin Roof game by the guy in Tennessee. I mean, I'm sure it's terrible. This theoretical game, but yeah, like, I mean, I don't mean to go out there and bash Cubicle 7.
That makes a lot of sense, and I think there is something, like a flawed work having just being able to still see like you're engaging with like the work of pausing on was. I'm pausing on was because I feel like I'm about to reinvent auteur theory, which I otherwise don't like. But but like a sort of case of like actually a connection to something maybe more human. That sounds very pretentious, but I'll land with that because I'd rather be pretentious than reinventing auteur theory. In a sideways thing, I guess, to other mediums and stuff. So we talked a bit about. About reading. And I was wondering, do you ever notice sort of subtler influences from different mediums?
I don't think subtly is the word. What I really like, I don't massively like film. I'm going to get crucified by people who are friends with me on Twitter, but I'm not a huge fan of film. What I actually really like is television. And I actually really like both good, high quality drama that other people enjoy and that is widely regarded as good. I also like really, really trashy stuff. I'm a massive fan of EastEnders. I'm a huge fan of The Archers, which is like it sounds incredibly sad to say it out loud. But I really like trashy soap operas because I just think they're so much fun. And actually, I have written games about this in the past and just thought, you know what? Let's just lean into this. You like weird, quiet pastoral dramas. Maybe you should just go out and write those things. And yeah, I feel very influenced by visual media. Like, I like visual arts. I like landscape art. I I love seeing landscape, not photography, but like when landscape is filmed from a drone as part of a TV program. I love that. um, I like watching Country File just for that, you know. Just think it's
Yeah.
interesting, and um, I like to see what places look like, both from a human perspective, but also um, from the landscape's perspective as well. You know, what does it feel like to be a hill? No, that's daft. But um, what might it feel like to live on that hill? I think is maybe a more interesting question, which is sort of what the Shepherdess as a role playing game was kind of about. You know, how
Yeah.
does this person feel connected to this place when they have literally no other things to think about? Um, and maybe that's interesting.
Yeah.
So
Just looking
then
about drone
these
footage.
aren't subtle influences at all. I would say that what I read, you know, speculative fiction, I would say that is more the subtle influence in many respects.
Do you think when you're thinking of influences like things like EastEnders and The Archers, these sort of pastoral dramas, or no, sorry, Archers, yes, pastoral. EastEnders with the sort of I want to say pulpier, but that it carries different implications. Soapier,
No,
soapier. I
no,
was
it
blanking on the
is
word soap. Soap. Um,
it is really pulpy. That is an accurate
yeah,
statement. Yeah,
I
I've
think
never
that
thought
is
of it like that.
accurate, but I feel like if I say that and people who don't know what EastEnders are, I think they get a very different idea of what that show is, even though I think it is
Do you
also
know?
accurate.
Sorry, before you carry on your sentence, but like if you think back to what pulp fiction actually means, it means super cheaply produced books that are produced in serial by effectively by somebody working on an algorithm. And actually that is not inaccurate when applied to a soap opera. So
Yeah, it's
I
definitely the
think
more modern, like televisual equivalent, like in many direct ways, rather than things that use Pulp Fiction as an influence.
yeah, like Pulp Fiction. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I guess I was wondering, when you're thinking about converting these things, are you thinking about um any sort of medium specific elements, or are you more thinking about the kinds of stories they tell and how you are taking stories into a different space?
I think with the game I wrote about EastEnders and The Archers and I don't know other stuff, which is called Cardigan Lane and was published in one of the Far Horizons short games digest. I can't tell you which one it is because I can't remember. Um, it was a lot about what is kind of now very casually referred to as genre emulation, which is not a term I particularly like because I think it's a bit dismissive. But it's that idea, as you've said, of kind of taking stories and characters that are massively larger than life and transporting them into a world where you can tell your own stories to a kind of set beat in the background, to a kind of this is what's going to happen in this session, this is what this character is going to do. And you know, like that's sort of what Powered by the Apocalypse. This isn't a Powered by the Apocalypse game, but it's sort of what Powered by the Apocalypse does, isn't it? Like the intent is to take character types and story beats and put them together in a world where you can tell your own stories based on interesting on works of fiction and works of art that you're particularly interested in. So like I feel like Apocalypse World does that in terms of Mad Max and other post-apocalyptic fiction. I feel like um Monster Hearts does that in terms of that is exactly what Buffy the Vampire Slayer is, you know. It's kind of it's all those things tied together that allow you to go away and bring together the kind of stories that you're interested in and make your own way through that. And Cardigan Lane to me was just a way of saying, well, if you wanted to go away and tell British soap opera stories, what are the story beats and character types that would allow you to do that, and what are the ways that you can tell that you can make this game that would tell those stories effectively. Um and I guess maybe I was successful at that. I'm not sure, but and again with other stories, I think it's that same thing of wanting to take a specific feeling of what a genre is and make that into something that you can use to tell your own stories. I don't think I do that very much anymore.
Hmm. It does feel like more of the recent games I've read of yours have been a move away from that. And I guess I was going to ask a bit about visual art. So I was thinking with the
Yeah.
Shepherdess, it has its cover, and in its which is a pastoral painting from, I'm blanking on the era, but I did remember this at the time. Um,
It's a romantic piece. I can't tell you when it is either. It's 1860s maybe.
yeah, I was blanking on romantic. It's taking like that as its almost like core image, and it's also in the book you talk about um, that this was a subject of painterly interest, and it seemed to me like something that was more perhaps in conversation with other mediums engagement with the same topics rather than emulating in the same way, or even less emulating if we want to use a less like prerogative word, if we were just saying something like translating or adapting. But it feels more like in conversation than in a
Yeah.
attempt to traverse something. I don't know if
I
you'd
sort of
agree or disagree
yeah.
with that.
No, what the Shepherdess sort of was me thinking, hey, the Shepherdess is kind of a really common theme in romantic paintings of a certain era and a common theme in kind of poetry of that era as a kind of noble savage in a way. It's a really hackneyed phrase that I'm pretty sure is fairly offensive, but
Yeah, probably quite
it
laden with.
it's yeah it but in a kind of way of more like Brave New World than a colonialist narrative in the anyway. I think what I mean really is that the Shepherdess as a fictional character is kind of misrepresented just off the bat because there's no actual understanding. I mean, there probably was significantly better understanding of what that rural traditional role was in the 19th century, but I feel like so it was smashing together me looking at loads of paintings and going, that's quite cool. I'm really interested in that. And then going away and actually reading a little bit about shepherding and thinking, that's quite cool as well. Yeah, let's just smash those two things together. So it comes from a place of kind of artistic and aesthetic interest and maybe being a bit tongue in cheek with playing with something that is almost entirely ahistorical and trying to smash that together with something which is maybe interesting and not very widely known to people, like what a shepherd's year would look like. And I think that's that kind of weird mashup of aesthetic plus factual stuff is maybe where my game design is at the moment.
No, it's really
Like,
interesting. It's bringing the
yeah.
phrases like slice of life or vignette to
Hmm.
mind, but
Yeah.
I feel like they
And
otherwise sort of carry different
I
baggage.
think like the word pastoral as well gets bandied around role playing games and maybe is a bit, I don't know, like people say Wander Home is a pastoral game, and I don't know, maybe I agree with that. It is a little bit about landscape, it's a little bit about maybe a quieter but greater theme. And I think that idea of slice of life and what does somebody else's life look like, I think that lends itself really well to solo games, which is another kind of thing that is kind of more so about 1,000 times more common nowadays than it was when I started playing role-playing games in my day,
Yeah, of course.
which was not that long ago. But
Yeah,
I guess I've been playing role-playing games for about 20 years. So maybe in my day it's reasonably accurate. But
yeah, it's scale.
yeah.
I only probably paid attention to role playing games around 2020. So I think there were some reasons around then that solo games got more popular, but I can't exactly recall what.
No, it doesn't make much sense, that, no.
um, Another sort of moving track. You work as a project director, writer, and editor for Far Horizons, which you've mentioned before. I was wondering how you feel like your work in that space informs the work you do more frequently,
Oh,
just as Marx as high water.
I think that's it's such an interesting question, because had I not, how do I put this? Had I not done work for Far Horizons, and I should say that when I started at Far Horizons, it was San Gennaro, and I was just writing, and then I started doing editing afterwards, and then I started doing project direction afterwards, because I'd seen the whole process that it took to take from somebody's weird game idea to having that game idea published in an anthology. And I sort of took that and ran with it, and then I could run projects. I mean, I ran the anthology for a bit, which was fantastic, and I still sort of do that role in a slightly different capacity. But understanding that publishing process from draft to document, if we're going to use D's for both of them, is something that I did not have any understanding of before. And it gave me the confidence to say, actually, I pretty much know what I'm doing. So I could go away and publish something that's quite ambitious. I mean, the one that springs to mind is A Loud Noise in a Quiet Place, which was on Kickstarter, and it's not it's not by any stretch of the imagination an ambitious project. It's a 16-page zine, but it required me to understand how to go out and commission artists. It required me to find an editor who I felt comfortable using. It required me to understand what layout designers needed. It required me to understand what my print shop needed. And if I hadn't done work for Far Horizons making games, I would not have understood 90% of the terms that I needed to in order to complete a game. It's not saying that as a naive game designer that you can't do that, but I think it gave me a massive advantage. And I think that's definitely something that has encouraged me to make bigger and bigger and more ambitious projects over time.
Yeah, it's easier to find your way through the wilderness if you can see footsteps.
Yeah. And just like connections as well. Like Far Horizons, I think, has 30 to 40 active members at the moment. And that's just a lot of people in the space who I think share at least some of my worldviews and at least some of what I believe in as a game designer, but also like ideologically. And I think it's very interesting to be able to connect to a lot of people who share your ideas but have different skill sets, and that just allows you to create something that is, it feels like, by spreading that out amongst other people, it kind of in a way feels more personal, which is like completely contrarian idea. Um
I
but
think I get what you mean. Like when you
yeah,
spread a rollout, someone like an individual's engagement with one thing is slightly different than an individual
yeah,
engaging with everything.
it brings out what you think your themes are, but I think beyond that it also allows you to focus on what your themes are, because you don't have to think about layout. You don't have to think about illustration. You don't have to think about what you're going to do on every single page and whether or not it's all spelled correctly, because you've got other people doing that labor for you. And that just lets you say, oh, actually, if I wanted to write this game to be specifically about this thing, I could just go away and do that. That's not something that I need permission to do. And perhaps that's one of the most liberating things about working in a small team as well. And again, I don't think I could have felt the confidence to commission editors and proofreaders and whatever had I not worked with them collaboratively on a project where everybody was invested in it by virtue of the more work you put in, the more money you would take from it. So
We mentioned themes there, and that's actually a useful segue to something else I wanted to ask about. You describing your actual work as leaning heavily on exploring social and philosophical themes. And we've talked about that here already, because we talked about how the shepherdess has a kind of approach to loneliness and about relationship with nature. I can see how like a loud noise in a quiet place is exploring like very specific personal experiences, which also relate to ideas of like accommodation and such. I was wondering when because I wonder this a lot about people who've returned to similar themes or have preoccupation with theming in general. Do you approach games at the moment or in the past from a sort of theme first perspective of, oh, I want to explore this thing in games, or do you find like you discover what the themes of the work you're doing is during the process?
I mean, so I think that depends on the piece. I think with a loud noise in a quiet place, that was about a very specific experience, an experience of temporary hearing loss. And actually, as I was writing the second edition, which was the published version, we kind of, because I did quite a lot of sensitivity consultation on that and spoke to quite a lot of deaf and hard of hearing people, the final product that came out there was quite different from the first edition of the game. So I think for that one, the themes definitely came out not just in the writing, but in the kind of post-writing stage as well, and in kind of the publication stage. So that was quite an interesting experience with the Shepherdess, which is largely unedited. And it's just a stream of consciousness, really. That game, I think I drew out a lot of what I wanted to say as I was writing the prompts. I found that what it was about like the kind of, yes, look, we're in this place and it's kind of beautiful, but also loneliness is kind of brutal and violent, and nature is kind of brutal and violent, and maybe maybe all of those things are linked. And that, so that's one thing, but it comes from this idea of, well, I want to write a game which is about a topic rather than a theme. So I guess in a very roundabout way to answer your question, the answer is that the theme develops through writing in a way which kind of makes me think, well, actually, does that make writing play, emergent play? I mean, that's a kind of very airy fairy way of saying something, but I think it's interesting to write a game basically without really thinking about it, and then going back and finding out what you've written, and finding out that what you've written is either complete nonsense or perhaps there's some kind of profundity in there which you might be able to bring out with editing and careful layout and stuff. And that's interesting in itself. And like with somebody who has at least one or two major projects on their mind at any one time, I'm really hoping that when I do finally come to sit down and write out what those games are, that I will be able to work out what the themes are at the same time.
Yeah, no, I understand that completely. This is interesting and completely understandable, yeah. I feel like Ghostbox, when I was reading it, invites the player to create a sense of place by populating residents near the postbox. Especially when you're saying like the next update will involve sort of presentation of things in fiction. But what I was curious about was, did you have much of a specific setting in mind when writing the game, or did you envision that as almost like a sort of one-sided collaboration between the text and the player in terms of creating the world?
That's, yeah. Ghostbox sort of fell out of a conversation I had with James Chip. Do you know James? Really
Not
interesting
directly.
person. Sort of writes weird OSR games and games also a lot games about landscape and plants and moss. And it's just a very interesting person to talk to. We had a conversation about a post box which is near their house in the middle of a wood, and James sort of asked me, "Who do you think uses this post box?" And like that's basically the genesis of Ghostbox. So in a way, when I was writing it, I was thinking there's a post box in a wood, and people use it, but they're not really sure why they use it because they're not even sure it gets collected. And I had this very specific image in my mind, which was kind of reinforced by me looking through stuff on Unsplash and just finding pictures of weird post boxes. And that's very much influenced by a sense of setting, like you said, but not really but also at the same time wanting to encourage people to think about just post boxes in weird places. Like I must have told this story 3 or 4 times, but there was a post box in Manchester train station. In Manchester train station doesn't exist. In one of the main train stations in Manchester, and the Royal Mail decided it was too much effort to go onto the platform and collect this post, so they nailed it shut. But at some point, the piece of wood fell off, and people kept posting letters in it for something like 35 years, and
Oh my god.
eventually it got too full, and there was post coming out the top. So somebody reported this, and they emptied this post box, and out came all of this mail, like 35 years worth of dead letters. And I just thought, holy smokes. So let's think about places that have weird post boxes that people are using. Let's make a community around them. Let's think of some weird citizens who might live there, like the guy who is obsessively writing love letters to a person who's not responding. Let's think about the spy who's been there for 20 years without knowing what their mission is. Let's think about I don't know, the people who are sending thank you cards to their estranged aunt for some reason. Like all these weird people, let's get them in this place, let's get them writing stories, and let's make a place that feels real but also surreal at the same time, let's try. I mean, somebody said to me, I'd like to use Ghostbox as kind of a world building exercise for a community. Do you think that would work? Yeah, it would, but it would give you such weird characters that I'm not, it would be for a very specific game, I think, but
Yeah,
it could
it
be
has
very cool. Yeah.
a taste of the sort of absurd, but in a way that is very sort of then grounded in feeling and environment almost.
Kind of, yeah, and kind of emotion and sadness particularly, and kind of abandonment, but also like you don't keep sending letters in a postbox that you think is blocked up unless you have some vain hope as well. So there's throughout it I've tried to, I think the second draft, which you're not privy to, is better because it's got these vain ideas that there's sort of a hope to this as well. It's not just really sad and depressing, and you can play it in a way that has whatever emotions pinned to it as you like, but I think the hope is always kind of there.
I think it's an
Maybe that's a
interesting
metaphor.
engagement with sync where you presumably know what the possibilities are, and you wouldn't do it if there was no hope, but also you might not do it if there was certainty either.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I think about the Forlorn, which was kind of the first. That's the one that's about the person who's writing to their lover and they're not getting any response. Like you, you just couldn't keep doing that if you knew there was no way you would get a reply. So you must always have this little hope in your mind that you are going to get a reply this time, that it is going to happen. And I don't know. That was one of the kind of starting seeds. Like when I realized this was a game that I wanted to write, that's where I started, because that felt like an interesting story that you could tell, but certainly not the only story.
Yeah, switching tracks again. I'm sort of bouncing around. I'm not good at segues. I've noticed it this episode, and I also look back and see it's always been true in other episodes. A loud noise in a quiet place focuses a lot on translating like your experience of temporary hearing loss into play. What I found interesting when I was thinking about was the section where the player outlines their character is left quite open.
Yeah.
I imagine something quite sort of reality based, but that also may just be a sort of context or stuff I'm bringing to things. Um, I was, I guess, wondering what was maybe informing that decision of how open things were there.
I think I was going through a sort of game design mood where I didn't want people to make characters in a mechanical sense. And this is really driven by my experience of games like Fall of Magic, where you don't define anything at the start of play except what symbol you're going to use to represent your character. And what I wanted to take from that was, what can we do with looking at characters who are basically just defined by the answers to 3 quite short questions? I can't even remember what the questions are because it's been a while since I looked at the text. And the decision there is more about what can you learn about that person and their life through play, and not just through play, but through their experience of the world. Like, I feel like A Loud Noise in a Quiet Place is a very first-person game, and it's... if I'd written it nowadays, it would have been a solo game, and it was a duet game because I didn't know any better. And it's definitely a very first-person game because the experience itself, to me, was very isolating and was very first-person. And I feel like throughout that experience, I learned things about myself which I maybe didn't know, like how much I was dependent on certain sounds, how soothing I found certain sounds, how much I was reliant on one particular balance of senses. And that's a very personal experience. And trying to bring out that experience in a game is a challenge, and would be more of a challenge if you made more of a definition of what the character looked like at the start of play, because I think that would constrain you too much. So when I've played through A Loud Noise in a Quiet Place, I've generally gone down the lines of playing out what I think that person's life might look like for a few days. And then I find what their relationships are. I find who they rely on. I find who's important to them. And maybe like the chance encounters with a person who might just be a casual acquaintance, and how that, their response to what you're going through might shape what you're going through a little bit more, might change how you relate to them or to other people. And it's just a very kind of revelatory experience. And that's really kind of tooting my own horn on it, really. But I think it has the potential to be to help people to build empathy with people who are going through this experience or similar experiences, or maybe more permanent experiences of the same nature. And that's my hope. That's always been my hope with that, and my mission. Well, not my mission, but like my stated aim of A Loud Noise in a Quiet Place is that it's meant to politely build empathy. I'm not sure that wording made it into the final draft. I hope it did.
Yeah.
But
It does make sense to me, yeah, that pursuit of empathy is perhaps easier when you're not necessarily seeing a character as building blocks you've put together at the start, but as a process you are going through yourself.
Yeah. I think I've been a little bit influenced by the game 14 Days by Hannah Schaefer as well, which doesn't make a massive deal about setting up a character at the start of play. They're sort of a skeleton of questions with answers that you hang a character over. I was going to say something a lot more macabre than that, and I'm glad I didn't. But you know, it's that kind of maybe this is something that is more more authorly. In fact, maybe it's not, but like I don't want to say everything about my character at the start of the game. I don't want to write a 20-page backstory. I want to write a 2-paragraph description of what they look like and how they walk, and then work out what that means thereafter.
Yeah. Staying on that, I want, like, we've talked about this a bit on this episode, that this was influenced by your own personal experiences, and I believe you said you thought of it as a first-person game. What was writing that way and putting yourself on the page so explicitly, what was that like for you, I guess, in terms of like how did that feel to be doing that, and how
Really
do you feel?
cathartic.
Good.
I wrote this game in the before times. I used to cycle to work, and it's like a 9-mile cycle, and I can't really concentrate on anything while I'm doing it because otherwise I'd get knocked off my bike. When I lost my hearing for a while, I had to get the bus to work, and getting the bus is really boring, and it gives you a lot of time to just think. And I was feeling like absolutely miserable because I couldn't relate to the people around me very well. I couldn't relate to my kids. I couldn't relate to my partner. My colleagues were basically just ignoring me. And I just sort of sat down and I started writing this game. I thought, well, why not? And so there was this real feeling of catharsis and getting something out into the world that felt very just like raw and emotional, and turning that into a game that other people could play and enjoy was like, that was quite a nice experience overall. It changed how I felt about that experience and made it more like, maybe I can get something positive out of this. Maybe other people can get something positive out of this. And that was in, when did I do that? 2018, maybe. And the second edition was kickstarted in 2000 and maybe 2021. That sounds right. So there was like a 2.5-year gap between those two, and a lot changed in my life, but like a lot changed in the draft. And like I said before, a lot came out of like consulting with other people who have deafness or some kind of hearing impairment that makes their life, not difficult, but like very different to what I would understand as my balance of senses. And I think all of that coming together made it kind of less about my personal experience, but more just about a personal experience of what it's like to have that experience. I'm just going to keep saying experience until it sounds like a normal word again. And I think putting myself on the page, which I have done with other games as well, maybe unpublished games or maybe games that I don't tell people are about myself. I think it's a way of dealing with yourself and understanding your own identity in terms that maybe you think can be gamified. I don't know, but like coming to terms with your own identity is an important thing, and something that I think maybe everybody should write games to do that.
Yeah, no, it does make sense. And there's something interesting about the idea of games I don't tell people or about myself, because I think that's probably true of some of my work as well. This is a
I
sort of
think it's
off
better
mic.
to keep your secrets sometimes. Yeah. Otherwise, people think you're really weird.
I also think there's a thing that, like, you know, engaging in autobiography or filtered autobiography, I think, can be really creatively satisfying. I also think it is probably frustrating if that becomes a reputation and there's an assumption that everything you do is that, which I suppose
Yeah,
is the
that's
risk
true.
of being open about parts of a process.
Mm, mm. I think so. Like I've written quite a few small games over the years that I think say something about me, and I don't need to say that this is saying something about me because I think a lot of my experiences are not particularly unique to my. Well, in fact, I know none of my experiences are unique to myself. You know, everybody has the same feelings from time to time, and yeah, like maybe we should just make games that do say things about ourselves that other people can relate to. I think that should be the goal of game design.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think we're at time, basically. Thank you for coming on. It was a really enlightening conversation. Where can people find you on social media, whatever platforms that may be? I don't know exactly when this episode comes out, so as it currently stands, Twitter exists. Will it by the time of release? No one can say.
Anyone's guess. You can find me on Twitter, being TTRPG's most horrible goose, at I am Phofos, which is IAMPHOPHOS. Yeah, engage with me; it makes my day. I am on Mastodon. I will only start looking at it once I have one fewer social media platform to engage with because it's too painful to do two. Most of the time, you can find me on Discord at a lot of places. I'm on Discord way too much. But it's quite hard to kind of describe how to find me on Discord. So, yeah, it's
Do you
just
have
one of
a
those things that if you know, you know.
card, or have I made that up?
I do, yeah. It is marx-shepherd.card.co. You can find me there.
Yeah.
I'm also the community manager for Far Horrizons Co Op, so you can find me at the Far Horizons Twitter, where you'll probably also be able to find the Mastodon details for Far Horizons. There is a Discord server for Far Horizons, which you're welcome to join. I don't know how you would do so. You can probably get a link from our newsletter, which will be linked from the Twitter page for now. Yeah, we're really good at social media at Far Horizons. We're just the best. And yeah, if you particularly liked hearing my voice, you can listen to the back episodes of Yes Indeed Pod, which has now been taken over by Thomas Manuel. And you can find my stuff on itch.io at marks-of-highwater.itch.io. Marx is with an X, more Groucho than Carl, I would say. There's a fair amount of Carl in there as well. And yeah, I think that pretty much covers all the bases.
Yeah, well, thank you. That's very comprehensive. Thank you again for coming on, and to my viewers,
Absolutely.
I'll catch you on the
you.
next episode of This Is Your Life Path. And in the meantime, reach for the sky.